So first of all, it's really great to be here and to share our experience with you. For those of you who don't really know much about Malta, it's a very small country, the smallest EU member state. It has a population of about 450,000. So really just about the size of a small city or a big town. It's just 360 square kilometers. Without traffic, you could probably cross it in half an hour. I'll give you a little bit more of the context as I go along in this presentation. So what I hope to talk about, okay, let's see. There you go. Is to give you a little bit about our current context. Just explain to you what the Consultative Council is and how it functions. How we arrived at the recognition of same-sex couples and what forms of recognition we have. The impact of the legislation, and then some of the strategies, challenges, and messaging around this. So where's Malta at? I'd just like to start off by showing a short video clip. I need my assistant to do that. And this is a short clip that our government presented in relation to Malta's Pride Week last September. So what's extraordinary about this is that it's actually the government that has produced this video. And when I joined the movement back in 2003, this would have been unfathomable. We wouldn't ever have thought that we would get to this point, that it would be the government that would actually be affirming and pushing for LGBTIQ equality and promotion of diversity. And the main LGBTIQ movement in Malta started in 2001, so relatively recently, I would say. We've come a long way since then. And at the time, it was really just this small group of people who felt that something needed to be done. They didn't know exactly what and how, and they didn't really understand all the ins and outs and the issues, but they felt it was time to do something. And obviously, as the movement established itself and learned and linked in with the European movement and with ILGA Europe and then eventually TGEU and RYI, the expertise also and the advocacy capabilities of the movement grew, and their interactions with politicians and policymakers also developed. So at the moment we have quite a well-established LGBTIQ movement with quite high visibility and a strong voice also in relation to government. We have a favorable political landscape. So the party in power at the moment is the Labour Party, and they've been in power since 2013, and immediately on coming to power, they took a number of initiatives which showed that in a sense they were willing to advance this area of work. And one of them was addressing discrimination against trans people. We had a court case that had been going on around the right of trans people to marry a person of the opposite legal sex. It was possible at the time for trans people to change their legal gender under certain conditions, but still they weren't allowed to marry a person of the opposite sex. And we had a case that went all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, and a settlement was reached with that person, and a change in the law was made like 2 months after the party came to power. And that was the first indication, and then the second was the setting up of this LGBTIQ consultative council, which I'll come to. So a lot of the changes that have happened since then have been done in collaboration with the LGBTIQ movement. We've been able to make changes quite fast when you consider in 5 years. So although certain things we could never have imagined in 2003 when I joined the movement, it's possible that things can actually change very, very fast. And it's always important, I think, to seize the opportunities when they presented themselves. We also have a number of mainstreaming initiatives. So Malta launched its first LGBTIQ action plan in 2015. It covered a 2-year period, and last September it launched its second LGBTIQ strategy and action plan, which covers 2018 to 2022. So now we're at a stage where sort of our legislative framework is more or less complete, and it's about filtering down the impact of that legislation to everyday people's lives, right? So to make sure, for example, that educators are trained and sensitive to LGBTIQ issues, that schools are safe places, that LGBTIQ people can access healthcare in a non-discriminatory fashion, that those who are victims of hate crime or hate speech are able to report and to come forward. So all these things that make a difference in everyday people's lives. And government now is working on this, and the setting up of the SOGIGESC Unit, which I had, is one of the ways of doing this, right? So it's not just now the NGOs that are pushing and doing the work and providing services, but it's also hand in hand with government. There's also been, since 2003, increased access for civil society to access government funding, which was also important in terms of capacity building of NGOs. And hand in hand with this has been the general acceptance from Maltese society of the LGBTIQ community. So there's, I think now, a better understanding of what it means to be LGBTIQ. Not necessarily all people understand the difference between lesbian and trans and intersex necessarily, but they know they exist, they know they have different needs, they know that equality and diversity is something to be valued. And also, and this is important in terms of governments, that Malta has achieved international recognition for the work that it has done, and it feels good to politicians when they get patted on the back, right? So this has been a positive for them. So as has been said, Malta rates first on ILGA Europe's Rainbow Index. We have a couple of things we're still working on, but we hope to have that 100% actually within the next year. And in relation to family law, as you can see, we tick all the boxes, which doesn't mean that there are no problems, but in terms of legislation, at least, right? So we have all of those things. So just to explain what's this LGBTIQ Consultative Council, and I'll mention it because I think it's a valid instrument that the that was introduced, and that made a huge difference in terms of our legislative framework. This was an electoral manifesto pledge of the Labour Party in 2013, that if they came to power, they would set up this consultative council, and it basically brings together all those entities who are working on LGBTIQ issues in Malta. And its remit is basically to advise government on legislation and policy related to LGBTIQ issues. Okay, so in terms of who sits on this consultative council, we have representatives of political party groupings. So generally the political parties will have an equality branch or a specific LGBTIQ branch, and representatives of those will sit on the consultative council. The NGOs, the civil society movements, so the Malta Gay Rights Movement, the student body, we are, for example, at the university, Allied Rainbow Communities, another NGO. There are also LGBTIQ Christian groups and parents of LGBTIQ people who are represented, also regional. Malta has two main islands, Malta and Gozo, and the smaller island also has a representative, broader human rights NGOs who work on LGBTIQ issues, and also the trade union movement is represented. So it's quite a broad cross-section. And what that has meant is that all the legislation that has been implemented post-2013 has been either drafted, so where the Consultative Council members actually drafted the legislation, or endorsed by it. So we're quite heavily involved in the process. And that means that we could put forward what we considered as LGBTIQ movement, the best practices. We understood the political context, we had to work within certain boundaries, but we always sought to put forward the best legislation possible. And initially we were a bit skeptical about whether these proposals would be accepted as we propose them, whether they would be watered down throughout the parliamentary process, but actually starting with the first bill that the Consultative Council was involved with, which was the Civil Union bill, actually we found that our proposals were accepted as we proposed them. And so that gave the Consultative Council more standing, but also sort of confidence in going forward. So to just mention some of the sort of major milestones along this journey. In 1999, there was a popular talk show program. It's called Sharabank. Sharabank is a Maltese word meaning bus, and it's where a lot of gossip tends to happen, right? So this program, which still runs today and still has the highest viewer ratings on Maltese TV stations, was the first one to include in a discussion panel two gay people, a gay man and a lesbian. Of course, alongside a priest and a judge and others. But it was the first time that someone gay was actively talking about being gay and being openly out on national television. And then, and since then, Sharabank program has had a number of other programs that looked into same-sex marriage and trans issues, etc. So visibility has been an important thing for the movement. 1 year after the setting up of MGRM, the Malta LGBTIQ rights movement, there was a conference which they organized jointly with the Union of Professional Psychologists. And again, that was the first time where the leader of the MGRM actually came out as gay, representing the movement. So that is when sort of the movement started to become visible. In 2004, Malta joined the EU, so that's also another milestone. It's not written here, but it's important because that led to the first references in our legislation to sexual orientation. And then in 2008, the MGRM had a petition which they presented to Parliament and which garnered over 1,000 signatures in favor of recognition of same-sex couples. Which led then to 2011, where again the civil society organization drew up this position paper on marriage equality, which laid out the arguments in favor of why this was the form of recognition that they opted for. Also in 2011, Malta had its divorce referendum. Malta only made divorce legal in 2011, just to give you an idea about our social context. And that was also important because it was a huge blow to the Catholic Church in terms of the moral standing and authority that the Catholic Church had in Malta. So without the divorce referendum and without the yes to divorce in 2011, I very much doubt we would have been able to progress with any of the LGBTIQ legislation. In 2012, the government at the time proposed some form of recognition. So Malta at the time did not have any form of cohabitation legislation for any couple, heterosexual or same-sex, and they were working on this legislation, but the proposals they were putting forward was so minimal that the LGBTIQ movement refused to endorse them. So I think this was important in the sense that it shows that the LGBTIQ movement had grown, also felt empowered enough to reject a form of recognition. So they would not settle for any form of recognition. It had to be meaningful recognition. And they were willing to wait for something that was meaningful, and this was done in consultation also with the LGBTIQ community. And then in 2013, the process started for legislating on civil unions. And the Civil Union Act in Malta was quite well debated. It was a very public debate. Sometimes it got ugly, as it did in Ireland. It wasn't a referendum, so we only had to convince the political party in government, which had an absolute majority. So once they were on board, then so we didn't have to convince all of Malta, right? Our process was very different in that sense. And the main issue of contention was not so much recognition of same-sex couples. I think by then Maltese society had sort of moved forward enough that they were accepting that this was necessary. But more the issue of parenting. That seemed to be the sticking point. And at the time, the polls showed that only 20% of Maltese society were in favor of parenting rights for same-sex couples. And this was always framed in the context of adoption. It was very hard for people to figure out that actually lesbians and gay people can have their own biological children. It was always framed in terms of adoption. And then, but then once that law was passed, actually, there was very little outcry, things went on, and Malta did not change from one day to the next, great disasters happened, and then it became much easier, of course, to follow up with marriage equality in 2017. And earlier this year, Malta also introduced changes to the horribly named Embryo Protection Act. So until earlier this year, it was actually a crime in Malta to donate sperm or egg. You could go to prison for doing it. And it was only in amendments to the act that happened in June of this year that it became possible for lesbian couples to access reproductive health services and for gamete donation to happen. So some of the strategies that we used, well, I think the most important one since the birth of the LGBTIQ movement has been visibility in the media. That's essential. It was the way in how we could be known as people. So it wasn't this anonymous body of people who were gay and lesbian, but it was people they met in the streets and who were human, right? And we were lucky to get quite good coverage in the local media. But it took a lot of years to arrive at a legislative change. And part of that visibility led to awareness raising. So initially it was mainly through personal stories, people who were willing to come out and to tell their stories, but then it transitioned into more a focus of a human rights kind of discourse, right? So where it wasn't just about me going on television and telling my story, but it was me talking about human rights standards and issues. So the discourse also evolved. There was a specific point in time where the movement also decided, so it was a conscious decision to start referring to children. And this was also important because until then they were kind of hesitant to link same-sex couples with children because of the fear of a negative reaction. But at one point in time, said, no, these families already exist in our society. They're here. We can't continue to ignore this reality. We have to start talking about it. So from that point on, then every discussion about same-sex couple recognition also included recognition of families, rainbow families, and that was also important. We were lucky in that Malta being such a small country, we have direct access to politicians. It's not really very difficult to get an appointment, to speak to a minister, to email a minister, to meet your minister in church, right? It's such a small community. Yet in the beginning, we would have these meetings and the word gay was never mentioned. It was like you and them and people like you, you know? So it took a while also for the terminology to become part of the narrative and for politicians to feel comfortable saying the word gay. Now we hear the word genderqueer and LGBTIQ in parliament and, you know, in our news broadcasts, and it's again, for someone who's followed this trajectory, it's quite astounding that it's become an everyday acronym. One of the strategies we used in the run-up to the civil union legislation, because one of the main contentious issues was parenting, is that we organized a closed meeting. So it wasn't open to the press. It was just bringing a number of rainbow families with their children in a closed room to meet with key politicians from both the government and the opposition side. Just to have this, you know, we're here, we exist, these are our families, you know, we love our children, they're happy, they're well-adjusted, you know, and to humanize the issue. So we felt that was really important. It didn't shift the opposition, but it actually consolidated the position of the party in government. So that was also important. We were lucky also to have political leadership. So to have, at the time in the run-up to the general election, the leader of the opposition talk in mass meetings with 100,000 people, mentioning the need to advance on LGBTIQ equality, and then following the election, because politics in Malta is very partisan. The sense of belonging to a particular political party is very strong, and so if the leader of that party is talking about the issue, even if you might, you know, have some misgivings, the fact that your leader is saying that matters a great deal. So that was also important, and for that leadership to be willing to go against majority public opinion was also important. So they took some risks at the political level, which I think in the end paid well for them. Another strategy that the movement used is that before every election they would issue their own manifestos. So these are the things that we would like to see happen in the next legislature. Where does each political party stand on each of these issues? And those manifestos were then made public. So voters knew, if I vote for this party, this is what they have promised, right? I think it was a strategy that was also used in Ireland. But it's very helpful. So we didn't tell voters who to vote for. We said, this is what where they have positioned themselves in regards to all of these issues that matter to us. And then, as I mentioned, the Consultative Council, which proved to be important. How am I doing with time? I'll close down. Some of the challenges, because these are also important. So the lack of political will in the beginning for many, many years was difficult to deal with. As I said, public discourse around parenting was difficult. Religious opposition, although it wasn't as vocal as it was in other countries like France, for example, but it was still there, and the Catholic Church remains a very important institution. And sometimes the fast pace of change has proven quite challenging. So the fact that we have made all these legislative changes in like 5 years, in the beginning, it was government and legislation that needed to catch up with society, and now it's the other way around. Now we need to bring people around to all the changes that have happened. Shall I skip these? And then if you have questions. My time is up, right? Yes, okay.